Perhaps one of the most common phrases that parents utter to their children throughout the early stages of their childhood is to never talk to strangers. Strangers come in all shapes and sizes, from all walks of life, and though many strangers have the best intentions at heart, some live up to the nightmarish stories that parents tell their children to heed. What is up, Iwu crew? Today we are going to be covering a case so shocking it will make you hold on to your loved ones tighter than usual. Now, let's get into it. Frank Edward Ed Ray was born on February 26, 1921 in La Grande, California. His parents, Frank Sr. and Marie Ray, were a young couple navigating the world on their own terms. They decided to move to Chowchilla, California when Ed was young because they wanted their son to grow up amongst friends and obtain the best possible education that the Ray family could afford. Ed graduated from Chowchilla High School in 1940, and for the first time in his life, Ed was forced to truly consider what he wanted to do from that point forward. Deciding that he was not quite ready to leave Chowchilla and the comfort of his family's proximity, Ed decided to purchase a nearby farm. There he ended up growing crops like corn and raising cows, amongst other animals, for a considerable amount of time. Though Ed loved his farm and the work that it provided him with, he had nonetheless felt as though there was something missing from his life, something even more fulfilling. Ever since he was a young boy, Ed had always seemed to have an inherent love for his community. So, in the early 1950s, Ed decided to try something new career-wise, something that would allow him to give back to his community. Ed became a bus driver for Chowchilla's local school district, where he spent every weekday picking children up from their homes, dropping them off at Dairyland Elementary School, and driving them all home at the end of a long school day. In that regard, Ed's work was fulfilling, and his schedule was extremely consistent. Until one day, when his life changed completely. The children on Ed's route were all Chowchilla locals. In fact, most of them were even the grandchildren of his own former classmates from back in the day when he had attended Dairyland Elementary School himself. And, of course, all of the children were familiar with Ed. Most of them even looked forward to seeing him at the start and end of their days. The children on Ed's route were anywhere from 5 to 14 years old, and despite the vastness of their age range, they all treated Ed with the utmost respect while riding in his big yellow school bus. On the afternoon of July 15, 1976, Ed was driving his usual route to drop off students back at their respective homes after their second-to-last day of summer school for the year. On that particular day, Ed was driving 19 girls and 7 boys in the California heat. As Ed navigated down the familiar roads of Chowchilla, approaching the first of his intended stops in his route, he noticed something peculiar. Just ahead of the bus, on the usually open road, was a singular white van stopped in the middle of the route. As Ed approached the site, he noticed that there was another white van nearby. It appeared as though the one in the middle of the road was having some kind of difficulty and was effectively stuck, blocking traffic. Ed, being the ever-helpful man that he was, pulled to a stop just in front of the van and looked around for its owner to see if they were having engine troubles. As Ed shifted gears and put his foot on the brake, he saw 3 men simultaneously exiting the van in front of him. Almost instantly, Ed felt sick to his stomach. But it was all too late. The 3 men each held guns in their hands and wore pantyhose over their faces to disguise their identities. Before Ed could react, the 3 gunmen made their way onto the school bus, and one of them pressed a gun to Ed's temple. In his ear, the gunman told Ed to move away from the steering wheel without any trouble, or he would be shot. Ed, with his hands raised, moved out of the way so that one of the gunmen could commandeer the bus. He started to drive as the other two men patrolled the bus. Ed was acutely aware that he and the 26 children in his company were suddenly in a very dangerous situation, one they likely would not be able to get out of anytime soon. As the masked gunman drove into a nearby dry canal, Ed did his best to maintain his silence, in fear that the gunman would inevitably silence him for good if he spoke up, even to reassure the children that everything would be okay. As a result of Ed's silence, the children began to ask questions, as children usually do, regarding their whereabouts and their new destination. The youngest child on the bus, 5-year-old Monica Artery, became fascinated with one of the gunmen specifically, as the legs from the pantyhose covering his face were draped on either side of his head like the ears of a rabbit. As she had no way of conceptualizing the danger of the situation, Monica looked at the gunman quizzically and asked if he was the Easter Bunny. Monica's innocent curiosity in such a life-altering moment further demonstrated to Ed the severity of the horrific reality he found himself in, with children who were not even old enough to understand what was going on. Not that he was sure exactly what was happening either. At the base of the canal, the gunman proceeded to herd Ed and the 26 children like cattle into 2 separate vans, forcing all of them inside one by one. Once inside, the gunman slammed the van doors shut behind their prisoners and turned over the van's ignitions. Ed surveyed the inside of the vans as he and the children felt the earth move beneath the vehicles. The vans were stripped of anything functional and contained no food or water. As the vans began to drive off, Ed checked his watch and noted the time of their departure. Crowded in the back of the 2 vans, Ed and the 26 children found themselves being driven 11 long hours, with no bathroom breaks and no idea where they were headed. As the children were mostly young, the disregard for driving precautions caused the majority of the smaller children to experience intense motion sickness. Many of the children had to throw up in the back of the vans, while the older children tried to keep the younger ones calm by singing songs to cheer them up. The kids sang songs like Boogie Nights, Love Will Keep Us Together, and even their own rendition of If You're Happy and You Know It, Clap Your Hands. Except the children were far from happy, and even changed the lyrics to, quote, If you're sad and you know it, clap your hands. Hearing this, Ed started to feel even more anxious than he already had been. By the time it was 3:30 in the morning, Ed and the children had been brought by the masked kidnappers to a Livermore quarry nearly 100 miles from Chowchilla, where they had originally been abducted. Dazed, confused, and absolutely terrified, Ed and the children were escorted out of the unmarked vans one by one. As they each exited, one of the masked kidnappers made each individual child state their name and hand over a single piece of clothing from their person. Ed could not fathom what was going on, nor could he understand why he and 26 children were targeted for this attack. Worst of all, Ed could only assume that his fate, along with the children in his company, would be death. To Ed's surprise and horror, the 3 kidnappers led each individual child further into the quarry. As Ed was ushered forward, he noticed that there was a moving van beneath them. A moving van that had been buried 12 feet under the ground. The only part visible around the dirt was the roof. At the top of the roof was a small opening and a ladder that was lowered inside the van. Ed realized suddenly that he and the children were being herded deep into the van, and they were going to be buried alive. One by one, each of the children were forced to climb down the ladder into the buried moving van, and one by one, the horror of the situation began to set in, at least for the older children in the group. Inside the van were a variety of dirty mattresses of all shapes and sizes, and quite a few containers of water and food. Ed took a quick inventory of the inside of the van as his eyes adjusted to the lack of light. And then, before he could even speak up, the kidnappers proceeded to close the steel plate on the roof of the van to cover the hole that Ed and the children had entered through. Then, they heard the thump of dirt begin to be piled over the roof of the van, one shovelful at a time. Some of the children started to scream. One of them even fainted. Ed did his best to calm them down, but he knew all too well that his own fears were quickly taking over his ability to be calm. Soon enough, Ed felt himself crying right along with the children. He was positive that the roof could not hold the weight of the dirt being loaded on top of it. He feared it would inevitably cave in. With the van itself growing more and more stuffy, Ed looked around at the children, seeing their terrified faces, and then something peculiar happened. The oldest boy of the group, 14-year-old Mike Marshall, stood up abruptly and stated that he was not going to die without at least trying to get out. Ed, filled with a newfound purpose, stood up with Mike and had the older boys help out as they planned their escape. The older boys, along with Ed, gathered the mattresses that were strewn about the van and began to stack them on top of each other until the structure was tall enough for someone to stand on top and reach the roof. Next, the boys took their time climbing to the top of the makeshift mattress tower. As they did so, some of the other children handed them wooden slats from one of the bed frames inside the van. Once at the very top of the mattress tower, the boys used the wooden slats to try to dislodge a steel plate that covered the hole in the roof of the van. As they pushed against the steel plate with all of the strength that they were able to muster up, Ed and the boys realized that the plate itself was being weighed down with two enormous tractor batteries, just in case the group of hostages tried to escape. Each battery weighed about 100 pounds. As Ed and the older boys fought vigorously to move the steel plate and the two massive tractor batteries on top of it, they felt themselves succumbing to heat exhaustion and extreme muscle fatigue, as they had not eaten in almost a day and were quite literally suffocating underground. Some of the other children poured water over the heads of Ed and the boys in an effort to cool them off and keep them conscious. Despite all of their efforts, it seemed as though they really were trapped for good. As well, to their horror, the roof had started to collapse, slowly concaving towards them. But then, with one well-timed push, the steel plate moved. In an almost unbelievable turn of events, Ed and the boys were able to push back the plate and watch as some of the dirt piled on top of the van spilled off the roof. Ed helped lift one of the older boys out through the hole and instructed him to clear away some of the dirt and debris in an effort to make room for the other hostages. After doing so, Ed lifted the children out through the hole in the van's roof one by one. Once the children were all cleared out of the van, the boys helped to pull Ed out through the hole and to freedom. Just like that, the children of Chowchilla climbed out of the van nearly 16 hours after they had been buried alive. Ed and the children made their way to the quarry's guard shack near the Shadow Cliffs East Bay Regional Park in an effort to locate help. There they ran into a night watchman at the quarry who, though incredibly confused, offered to call the police and wait with the group for their arrival. Once local police arrived at the scene, they could not believe what Ed and the children claimed had occurred. When officers located the buried moving van, they were horrified about what had happened to Ed and the children, and relieved that they had escaped. The investigation into who was in charge of the kidnapping did not take long, as one thing was incredibly clear to investigators. Whoever was responsible had to have had access to the quarry for long amounts of time in order to bury a moving van of that size. Rather quickly, investigators were able to locate the quarry owner's son, then 24-year-old Frederick Newhall Woods IV, as he was known to access the quarry frequently during the summer. Once they found Frederick, police were quickly able to locate his two friends, the brothers James and Richard Schoenfeld. Upon arresting all three of the young men within 2 weeks of the initial kidnapping, the story began to unfold right before investigators' eyes.
The bus carrying the youngsters and driver from a summer school session at Dairyland Unified School was found empty in a bamboo-covered area of the dry Berenda Slough. There is no doubt the bus was deliberately hidden in the thicket, and dust on the seats indicated the 26 youngsters were not aboard when the bus was driven into the slough. The mysterious disappearance would also indicate that at least 2 people had to be involved, one to drive the bus into the slough and another to guard the youngsters. There were other vehicle tracks on top of the bus tire tracks in the sand. Many of the worried parents were waiting at roadside, while others kept an all-night vigil at the Chowchilla police station.
Frederick, James, and Richard revealed to police that despite coming from extremely wealthy families, the 3 of them had fallen into remarkably deep debt. As the men were in desperate need of money, they thought it best to hold hostages for ransom, like people often did in movies. So they kidnapped the children on Ed's school bus as they all headed home from class because, as James claimed, "We needed multiple victims to get multiple millions, and we picked children because children are precious. The state would be willing to pay ransom for them, and they don't fight back. They're vulnerable. They will mind." It is now believed that the 3 kidnappers had been inspired by the story "The Day the Children Vanished" by Hugh Pentecost, as the details of the story and their kidnapping are remarkably similar. As well, the book Alfred Hitchcock's Daring Detectives, where the story was published, was in the Chowchilla Library and would have been accessible to them. Unfortunately for Frederick, James, and Richard, they had been unable to call in their intended ransom demand of $5 million because every single family of the kidnapped children had been ringing the Chowchilla Police Department in search of their missing children. With clogged phone lines, the kidnappers had decided to wait a day to call in. And then, much to their dismay, they saw on the news that same evening that Ed and the children had actually managed to escape. Their plan had failed miserably. By the time the Chowchilla kidnappers went to trial, all 3 of them pled guilty for ransom and robbery. All 3 were sentenced to life with the possibility of parole. In 2012, Richard Schoenfeld was released from prison, and in 2015, James was paroled. Frederick Woods, on the other hand, as the main motivator behind the kidnapping, has been continuously denied parole over the years and remains in prison since his initial sentence. It is important to note that even though all 26 children and Ed Ray managed to survive the terrifying hostage situation back in 1976, the reality of the experience still haunts many of them to this day. Most of the children involved in the kidnapping suffered from anxiety, panic attacks, and a variety of nightmares involving kidnappings and death as a result of the trauma from the attack. In fact, most of the victims of the kidnapping even reported having continuous symptoms of trauma, even 25 years after the incident. The anguish that those children experienced at such a young age was carried with them throughout the majority of their lives, all because 3 men spent money they did not have and needed to pay back. After the incident, Ed Ray received a California School Employees Association citation for outstanding community service as a result of his bravery and work keeping the children safe on that fateful day. The children gathered together on August 22, 1976, a little over a month after their amazing escape, to celebrate Ed Ray. The group took a photo at the event, with Ray standing in the back. Ed died in 2012 at a nursing home in Chowchilla at the age of 91. Despite everything that occurred between the day of the kidnapping and the day he passed away, the children of Chowchilla never forgot what Ed did for them. In his last days, Frank Edward Ray was visited by many of the school children he helped save in the Chowchilla school bus kidnapping 35 years before.